Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The President of the Russian Federation spoke at the board meeting of the Russian Ministry of Defense with another bellicose speech. Putin promises to achieve all the so-called goals of the SVO, special military operation, and emphasizes that if this cannot be achieved diplomatically, the so-called historical territories of Russia will be liberated by military force. Moreover, the Russian leader habitually does not specify exactly which historical territories these are. Putin boasts of Poseidons, Burevestniks, Orshniks, and pays special attention to the so-called feats of the Russian military, who continue to liberate, as he puts it, populated areas on our territory, on the territory of Ukraine. Putin moved to direct threats against Europeans. And, accusing them of preparing for war with Russia, he emphasizes that Russia itself is ready to respond to any level of danger. The head of the Russian Ministry of Defense, Andrei Belousov, who naturally also spoke at this board meeting, made similar accusations against the West and Europeans. There would be nothing sensational in the tonality of these speeches, nor in their content, were they not taking place against the backdrop of so-called peace negotiations currently occurring between Ukraine, the United States, and European countries. And at a time when the United States continues to discuss the parameters of security guarantees for Ukraine with Kiev, and the fate of those territories currently controlled by the Ukrainian army, the Russian president expresses not even the slightest desire to end the war. In his speech, there was no room for either a peace process or American mediation. On the contrary, one can speak of a conscious and harsh escalation of tension. And this is being done, of course, not only by Putin and Belousov. As is known, on the eve of this speech by the Russian president, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, his deputy Ryabkov, and Putin's press secretary Peskov made similar statements. Obviously, they knew perfectly well the content of the speech that would be delivered by Putin at the board of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. And here it is worth asking a fairly logical question. We understand what Ukrainian diplomacy is doing, trying not to quarrel with the administration of the President of the United States against the backdrop of the continuation of Donald Trump's peace efforts. But it is most interesting what the American administration is doing. If, after the stay of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in the Russian capital, the tonality of the Russian president's statements did not decrease in terms of escalating tension even by an iota, and I could say that it even increased, because it was from this time that Putin began to systematically threaten Europe with war, this means that there is no need to hope for any real compromises with the Russian Federation. Especially since the Russians do not hide their intentions to liberate the so-called historical Russian lands. And to these historical Russian lands, one can, of course, attribute everything the Kremlin desires. In such a situation, it's not just about Donetsk or Zaporizhia, but also the Kiev region, the Zhytomyr region, Volyn, and even Halakina, Galicia, can be declared Russian historical land. And, by the way, this has already happened repeatedly throughout Russian history. It is worth looking at what Russians considered immemorial Russian land, say, during the First World War, and how they rejoiced at the return to their native home of Lviv. So the question arises regarding what such diplomatic agreements are about and with whom we are speaking today. Perhaps American officials know more about Putin's mood than we do. Many might think so when watching how negotiations between Ukrainian and American diplomats are developing. Or perhaps both Witkoff and Kushner, as well as Zelensky with Macron or Merz, simply do not want to irritate American President Donald Trump, who continues to live in his own reality, far from Putin's true intentions. And when Putin delivers overt speeches aimed at continuing aggression against Ukraine and destroying the neighboring state, Trump continues to convince everyone, and obviously his entourage as well, that the Russian president desires peace and would like to end the war. However, we do not see any real proofs of this yet. We do not see any diplomatic statements from any representative of the Russian leadership that would testify to peacefulness. Well, and when Putin himself comes out with bellicose statements, it is generally uninteresting what statements other Russian officials make. We see that Russia continues its offensive on Ukrainian soil, trying to occupy as many populated areas of Ukraine as possible. And we understand perfectly well that we are talking not only about those Ukrainian regions that were not simply partially occupied but also annexed by the terrorist federation. The enemy is trying to advance in the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. And we understand why, in order to hold their fictitious referendums there, declare the annexation of these Ukrainian regions to Russia, and at the next stage of the struggle demand the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from these Ukrainian regions as well. The famous Putin salami tactics, which were chosen by the Russian leader immediately after the fiasco of the Blitzkrieg of 2022. We see the continued destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. Odessa has not yet recovered from a massive attack. Other Ukrainian cities continue to suffer from infrastructure problems. Where do we see the desire of the Russians to achieve peace? And where do we see the readiness of the Russians to take part in that negotiation process which has been taking place in recent weeks after the unveiling of the so-called plan of Donald Trump? Most likely, the Russians' readiness to discuss this plan remains merely a smokescreen against the backdrop of intentions to continue the Russian-Ukrainian war to exhaustion as much as the Russian leader has enough funds and people willing to kill Ukrainian citizens for bloody Putinist rubles. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, to the channel on Patreon, which helps develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function on YouTube itself. Victory and peace to you. Good luck.